Psychedelics in our modern context are a class of compounds that are known to produce non-ordinary states of consciousness. They change subjective experience, they change one's experience of their psyche, the experience of self, the experience of connection to others, and um, has been used in a lot of different ways by Indigenous people as a part of their spiritual practices, as a part of gaining insight, making decisions. The four main compounds that we think about as like the classic psychedelics are mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. And for a number of different reasons, including sort of how the West has interacted with different Indigenous populations, and then sort of beginning to isolate, like the active compounds of psilocybin or DMT, for instance, as an active compound in ayahuasca or yahe, which is a common sort of psychedelic that's used. Mescaline and peyote, for instance, which is another, and then LSD being sort of chemically created by Albert or synthesized by Albert Hoffman and being shown to have some of these similar effects. And it seems like most of it molecularly, or a good portion of the action is being done through serotonin receptor 5-HT2A. So that's a way of how people have been thinking about how psychedelics, work to produce some of the effects that we're now seeing are, pretty powerful from a perspective of psychiatry, but also from just a broader perspective of sort of human evolution and human psychology, and our human development.
That's really helpful background, because what you are sharing is really that a lot of our medications come originally from seeing the effects of plant compounds that have been used, or plant products that have been used by Indigenous cultures, and then determining which of those have usefulness in our health and healing processes.
I want to speak to that because I was having this conversation with my dad, who's a naturopathic physician, and I've learned a lot from him in terms of thinking about a more holistic approach to healing. And I think in our Western society, we have a very reductionist standpoint. Like, we want to know, like, what's the molecule and how does this one molecule interact with this one receptor to do something, when in the truth of our experience, it's not just one thing, right? Like, in some of these mixtures in Indigenous compounds, there are hundreds of different compounds and many different plant species that are all being sort of mixed together to have specific effects. And sometimes I think in our Western approach or in the Western approach of like reductionism, we can sometimes miss out on things that we're just not seeing because we're not thinking about it.
So how do we know that we are protecting ourselves from harm?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When we first started within the Western framework, looking at these substances like 1950s, 60s is really when it started to be researched, even though they were like for instance, LSD was synthesized in the 30s, and we knew about these compounds before, but really started researching them in like the 50s, 60s. And at that time, the science was mixed in that it wasn't as well controlled and things like that. But it was very clear that there was a huge therapeutic benefit, and that the sort of safety risks were less to do with the medications themselves and sort of how they were being used and sort of the ethics around how they were being used, which is not unique to these compounds. But because I think with these compounds, you can be dealing with non-ordinary states of consciousness, it presents a certain kind of vulnerability and risk that I think is important for us to be even thinking about today. Since kind of like the psychedelic renaissance, or kind of this new wave of research in psychedelics, from places like Hopkins and NYU and now Yale and these places, the data is just very, very good for the safety of these compounds when one has thought about when one has thought about setting, when one has thought about integration. A lot of the sort of bad press around some of these compounds that led to them being moved into Schedule 1 had to do with sort of their use in a recreational setting, where there were like less safeguards, more chance for sort of vulnerability and risk. But I think within a clinical setting, and again, I use that term sort of with air quotes because I think there's also ways to kind of desterilize the environment and make it. I think a big part of it is actually making the setting less clinical and more comfortable and more welcoming and inviting. But all of those things play into, I think, the safety of these compounds. And as you've mentioned, and I mean, the results that we're seeing for things like depression, PTSD, end of life anxiety is just very, very compelling when looked at when looking at the risk, especially compared to some of the other compounds that we give humans for other types of conditions.
Hey family, if you're finding value in our content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us reach more Caribbean immigrants who need guidance, encouragement, and a safe space to talk about mental health. Let's build this community together because our well-being matters. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. One love.